Hey folks, David Stewart here. Got a couple questions on the channel, so it's time. I'm going to try to answer those, and this is going to piss some people off. So if you don't agree with me, please leave me a comment down below and let me know what you think, because I'm happy to entertain all opinions, and certainly my opinion is not the only one. Here's those two questions. They're both from Duncan Destruction. First one. What do I consider to be the best form of government? And the second one, what is the role of education in shaping people's opinions of policies and government? So let's start with the first one. What's the best form of government? The truth is there is no best form of government because people are not interchangeable beings. What is best for one person is not best for another person, and what is functional or really good in one culture is completely dysfunctional in another culture in terms of government. You can't say, like, even if you decide that the constitutional representative republic that the United States has is like the best form of government, and you decide, well, since it's the best form of government, everyone deserves to have it. Everyone deserves to have this great liberal democracy where people are free to speak their own ideas and they get to have a say in what the government does. So you go and you impose it upon another country, like the neocons basically wanted to do in the 2000s and did in some places. What's the result? And the result is chaos, not anarchy, but chaos and death and destruction and armed conflict. And you wonder what the hell happened. Well, the mistake is in thinking that a culture that has had thousands of years of evolution in one geographical area or in one particular philosophical direction will then, whatever product they come up with at the end of that, will then get transferred to a culture that's had a completely different evolution and completely different trajectory. And if you think of a country like Iraq has several ethnic groups and several religious sects that are very different from one another. The Kurds, there's Kurds in northern Iraq. Those are not the same ethnic people as the Sunnis and the Shiites in other parts of Iraq. So to think that all those people are going to automatically play nice with one another once you liberalize the government is really folly. It's a folly to think that. So there is no best form of government. There's just things that work in different ways in different parts of the world. And if you think about the way that culture evolves, if you're in a particular place, like if you're in a desert, you're going to have a different view of water than if you're at the Great Lakes. That in turn is going to change the way your culture values water, what sort of edicts and restrictions are placed on how you use water that just may not exist at all if your culture evolved near the Great Lakes. So much so that if you were to look at the final version of whatever governance that culture comes up with, it may be radically different from what the culture by the Great Lakes comes up with because it serves radically different functions. That's just reality. So I think in order to have like a modern Western liberal democracy, you have to have not just like an educated populace, but a populace that has, in general, the same view of what they want government to be doing and not to be doing and what those limits are on a cultural level, not just like a moral level, like we don't think the government should do this, but it's like, I don't want the government to do that to me, and I think it's wrong on a cultural level. And as you import other cultures, and Europe and America are both facing this reality, as you import other cultures that don't have those same cultural values, they in turn are going to try to put their cultural values into the government. What they think the government ought to be doing based on the way that their culture evolved in a different region of the world, so that you end up with a government that starts to overstep the bounds of what it originally was thought to be doing, because the people who have essentially established that government and empowered it however many years ago didn't conceive of a different culture with a different set of values taking hold of that government and putting it to different uses. And fundamentally, that's the danger of government force, right? Government is force. That's really the definition that I put on government. Now, I think this isn't really in this question, but I think it's worth talking about, because if we talk about the best form of government, best for whom? But what if we think about best for the system of government that it is itself? So the continuance of whatever governmental system. If we look at it, what's best for the people over the longest stretch of time and what seems to be the most stable over the longest stretch of time, I think that's also a really interesting historical discussion. And I think the most successful form of government is actually what I would say is tribalism, or really no government. And people conceive of like tribal governments as being governments, even though I would not classify them as government at all. And I'll give you an example or an anecdote from my life, and I think it's part of like Western bias is to automatically start taking actions that other cultures do and put them in the context of your culture to try to understand it. But I remember having to write this report on a book that was this long research study that these anthropologists did. And it's for an anthropology class. I took a lot of anthropology classes in college, and part of this report was I had to talk about the government of this tribe. And my initial reply in my first draft of the paper that I turned in was like, the tribe has no government. It exists and functions totally based on its inbuilt social restrictions, which was true. And he said, no. And I had this argument with the professor over it. He goes, you need to think outside the box, and think about what their government actually is. And I'm like, you need to think outside the box and consider that people don't always have governments. Because there was no force involved in this Amazonian tribe. And what it was is the writer of this book himself was having this Western bias of like, the government consists of these elders who, tell people what to do and they do it. And I looked at it and I'm like, well, what happens is people ask the elders what they should do and the elders tell them what they should do and then they do it. But there's never any force. Like the elders never raised their hand to anyone. They never threatened anyone with death. It was really just that in their culture, you respect your elders because they've been there and done it before. And they're like the keepers of your culture. They're the chroniclers of the existence of your people. And so you're going to go to them to figure out what's the proper way to do something. And of course, there was no system of punishment. There was no law in this little tribe. Everything was entirely based on like cultural idioms and cultural edicts, the way that everybody organized their lives, their marriage, because it was a tribe. And if you're in a tribe, everybody's really basically distantly related to each other. It's its own little genetic pool, which means, and if you've read some of Dawkins' work, like the selfish gene, the genes themselves want to ensure their existence, so they create a culture that's going to ensure the continuation of the tribe. I think that's an important concept to think about. So because it's this little tribe of related people, they act a lot like your extended family would probably act with each other. Is that if there's a conflict, you try to resolve it. Maybe if you can't get it resolved, you go to your grandfather and he tells you how to resolve it or what needs to be done to make peace. And if nobody can make peace, you just end up kind of avoiding that person in the family if you can't make peace with them. And if somebody does something really bad, they get like disowned. So the only actual punishment for this tribe, which they never saw, was probably just saying, you got to leave, you got to go. That's the only punishment, because there's no government, right? There's nothing that would be considered government anywhere else. It was just us saying everyone has a government, therefore what is the government, right? It's a loaded question. It's a little bit of a loaded question, even with that, and it's a bit of a Western bias. Now, going back to the thing of history, so tribalism, I think, is actually the most successful because it goes back, into like the mists of time before ever. And tribalism is what people really did until, even within other systems, people still had their village community, or the way that their village organized itself, and whether it used force or not, it would establish its own kind of government that would work exactly on the needs and the appropriate roles for what the people in the village thought should be done. Because when you're living next door to the mayor's living next door to you, he's not going to be like, you know what, I'm gonna write an order to confiscate your house and give it to me. It's like, it's not going to happen. He lives next to you, and someone else lives next to you that isn't going to like that, and they'll let you know what for. So when you have a really localized, any kind of governance, not government necessarily, but governance, then it's very, very balanced, because you're having to live with the people that you are possibly creating conflict with or trying to resolve conflict with. So I think tribalism historically is by far the most successful. It's the most stable. It's the one that benefited the individual people involved the most compared to anything. It's tribalism. Tribalism is like the best thing for people, and it's because people have evolved in tribes, and our genes are designed to do things in a tribal situation, not as a nation state. Our genes come from tribes, not from nation states. So even the organization of a nation state is a little bit outside of our regular way of doing things, which is to be tribal, I think. Now, besides tribalism, what's the most successful in continuing a stable system and sort of balancing all the things that we need to consider? I would actually suggest that it is feudalism. And there's been feudalism in all parts of the world. There's been feudalism in all the Asian cultures. India, China, and Japan have all had feudal governments. There's been feudal governments on the Korean Peninsula, and of course there was feudalism in Europe. And that feudalism in all of those places tended to last for very long times. There was even feudal relationships within various imperial dynasties in China. And the nature of the feudal system would change depending on, big upheavals of the political system. But you'd still have a feudal system. For instance, in Japan, you had, but prior to the Meiji Restoration, you had the Edo period, and prior to that, you had the Muromachi period, and both of those had a feudal system where you had the warrior class, the samurai, that were lords and had other samurai working for them, and then in turn gave tribute to the shogun. And the nature of the power between the shogun and the daimyo changed from the Muromachi period. Actually, there was three. There was the Heian period, the Muromachi period, and then the Edo period. So the nature of those changed depending on what political necessity of that period sort of demanded. But the reason I think feudalism lasted for so long in Europe and lasted for so long in Japan is because there's actually a little bit of a power competition between the higher ups and those down below that pay homage to the higher ups. From the top down, it looks, it's very top down. There's a king, and then there's, lords and dukes, and then there's knights, and then there's, they're protecting the peasants who are producing the food for the warrior class, if you think of it like that. But in order for the king to exist as king, or for the shogun to exist as shogun, or whatever, you had to essentially do it with the consent of all the other landowners, all the other lords, who in turn only existed because of the consent of the other knights that were underneath them. And if you did something that was really bad, if you tried to levy taxes that were too high on your lords, or you didn't do what they wanted to, you wouldn't listen to them about war or things like that, then they would actually depose you. And I think that's where feudalism gets this idea of like constant warfare. Warfare, I think, in the feudal period was a lot more limited than in other periods, in Europe and in Japan as well. But the reason was because in order to keep that power system stable, you could just depose the king. You could kick the king out and have a civil war and put a different king in there. You could kick the shogun out of Kyoto, or out of Edo, depending on the period, and put in a different shogun from the same family, or maybe from a different family, just depending on how things worked. So you essentially had this relationship kind of like, if you imagine that if like the states in the United States, a lot of people that are watching, I'm sure, from America, if the states could actually like mount a mounted force and just kill everyone in Congress and put a different Congress in if they didn't like what the federal government was doing. That's more like what feudalism is that there's a lot more threat from the lower downs when you're king. And the really stable monarchies, and I think of like the French monarchy as being a pretty stable one up until the later part of the 18th century. Those really stable monarchies were the ones that were very good at balancing the relationship between the top and like everyone else below. And the less stable ones were the ones that there was a little bit more upheaval. So I think feudalism has historically been very successful. And if you kind of discount the military conflict that's inherent in feudalism, you actually have a relatively stable life situation for the people that aren't in the warrior class, like the peasants and the freemen. They pretty much live generation to generation on the same land, doing the same thing forever. Like if an invading army came in, they'd go into the castle for protection, and then they go back about their lives. If they lost, if the city got sacked, then they'd put a new lord in, and they'd be like, all right, peasants, you're working for the new lord, and they're like, all right, off we go. And so for the average person, there was actually quite a bit of stability with feudalism. And I know there's too many examples of where it's not stable, but I think if you look far enough back, then it's probably pretty stable for the average person. So there's thinking of that. I think Republican forms of government are sort of doomed to failure after a certain amount of time, and that's because the civic mindset of people changes based on this reflexive relationship with government, is that government does something for people that in turn changes their mindset about the government, and then lets the government do more things for people until eventually you end up with a tyranny. So let's talk about the second question, which is what's the role of education in shaping people's opinions of policies and government? So the ideal, what Thomas Jefferson imagined, was you would educate everybody so that they could read. Then once they could read, they could digest all the political literature themselves. He imagined all these competing newspapers giving their own opinions on things and reporting different things. And then that average person would read the newspapers and develop from all of that competitive information a clear idea of who he should vote for and who would best represent them in the federal government, represent their area. And I think that that's a great way of thinking about it. However, once you establish something like compulsory education, whatever good intentions you had for establishing it don't matter, because even if you start it with the best people that all have the great civic mindset, they're going to pass that power on to people who think of things differently. So what is education now in the West? Education now in the West is, for the most part, a propaganda machine for the government. And it's certainly, I believe, is the case in the United States of America. I don't want to speak for all Western countries. I think it's there in most Western countries to a certain extent, but it's really bad in America, where literally everything you do is like American history. There's very little looking outside. And by the time you leave, you're so indoctrinated into the cult of the state. Every morning you have to get up and you have to pledge your allegiance to an object called the American flag. And if you do that for 13 years, you're going to really start to believe that you are morally obligated to have allegiance to that American flag. And you're going to start to really believe that whatever government systems you've been told over and over again are good and are moral. You will probably never have a discussion in any public school about the morality of government, or what things are immoral, or what things are moral or immoral for government to do, and you're not going to get any of that. You're not going to have any challenges on the nature of government itself, because history teachers tend to be fairly liberal, but also it's their job, right? They work for the government, so they probably don't have an opinion that like the government is a bad thing or does immoral actions or anything like that. There's always a pro-government bias in a government school. Like it's a really simple idea to think about. Why would the government establish an institution to teach kids how bad it was? No, it's going to establish an institution to teach kids how good it is. And I'll give you another anecdote from my storied life. I've been a teacher for a long time, and I've been like a public school substitute teacher a couple times in a couple different places. And so I was subbing for a third grade class some years ago. And one of the lessons I had to give was this little civics lesson, really basic civics lesson on, you pay your local taxes based on sales tax. You pay a little bit of money, and that gives you your basic essential services. Your police, your firemen, maybe your like road construction kind of guys from the roads, and whatever other basic things that you might have as part of like local government. And the subject of taxes came up, and this kid asked, "Hey, Mr. Stewart, what happens when you don't pay your taxes?" And knowing better than to like wade into that political minefield, I just asked the class, "Hey class, what happens when you don't pay your taxes?" And it was like a unison. They're like, "You go to jail." I'm like, and another kid asked like, "Hey, what happens if you don't want to go to jail?" And it's like, another kid yelled out like, "They'll kill you." So these 8-year-olds understood that the government uses force to collect taxes. But somehow, by the time people reach the age of 18 and leave school, the idea that taxes involve the threat of violence is like nowhere in their minds. Like you have these conversations with young adults where you're like, taxation's theft because it's violence and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, it's not violence. I'm like, what happens if you don't pay your taxes? And they're like, what do you mean? It's like, you choose not to pay your taxes. What happens? It's like, no one chooses not to pay their taxes. I'm like, they don't. Not because they want to pay taxes, but because they don't want to go to jail. Wesley Snipes, I think, went to jail because he didn't pay his taxes, right? He went to jail. So what happens if you don't want to go to jail? Well, the police come and get you, and they make you go to jail. And if you decide to attempt to defend yourself against that use of force, well, they're going to use force against you, of course, to defend themselves as well, and they're going to kill you. So at the end of any government action, whether it's taxation or anything else, is the threat of violence. These 8-year-olds understood it, but somehow the 12th graders, it's like if there's no connection in their mind. It's like this non sequitur. They don't understand it. Because they've never had a civics class explain it. The civics classes have avoided it for 12 years until it ends up being just two random points of data that aren't connected in your mind at all. Like taxation and violence have nothing to do with each other. Government and violence. And that's not to say that you want a government that's no violence, right? You want the police to be able to go get bad guys. In order to do that, they have to have a threat of violence. But I will say, under the libertarian perspective, we have this thing. It's called the non-aggression principle, which is that you don't initiate force. Well, I don't believe police are actually initiating force in most circumstances where we would think of criminals acting. And that's because the criminals have initiated force. They've hurt somebody, they've stolen from somebody, and so the police go with the threat of force to respond to that, to execute justice on them, whatever the justice system happens to be. We can have other videos about like different kinds of justice systems, because there's lots of different ways of thinking about the nature of justice. So anyway, that's what I have to say about that. If that is terribly upsetting to you, please let me know in the comments. If not, then maybe you're with me on that. But the short answer is there's no ideal government, because people are very different and live very different lives and have very different needs for whatever their government organization has to be. So there's no one-size-fits-all government. There's no best government, because there's no ideal man. People live different lives. And then what does education do to shape people's opinion? Ideally, it educates them enough to read, to make their own opinions. But that's not what really happens. If you have a compulsory system, then of course the government is not going to teach things that are against its own interests. So you will always have a pro-government bias in any sort of publicly funded and mandatory education system. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Please let me know what you want to see and what you want to hear. Been out of it for a couple days because my family's been super sick, and I am actually a little bit sick as well, if you see the nice sweat sheen on my forehead. My book is out, Muramasa Blood Drinker. I really appreciate it if you read it. That's a great way to support the channel if you like what I do. It's 99 cents. That's cheap, and I hopefully will deliver some value for that 99 cents. And of course, if you read it and you have a moment, please give it a rating on Amazon. That really helps me out a lot to legitimize what I do as an independent author. So I really appreciate you watching, and I look forward to what your comments are on what you think the best form of government is. Have a great one. Ciao.